Welcome to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith, and today I'm bringing you a review of Erin Morgenstern's The Starless Sea. I've talked about it in a couple of vlogs, possibly vlogs that have not been posted on this channel yet. Not sure. Last week I finally read my copy of Erin Morgenstern's The Starless Sea. It is up on my shelf here because it's not the heftiest book, but I did not want to be carrying it for this whole video. If you do want a closer view of the cover, I will put one up now in case you wanted to see it in all of its Technicolor glory. I didn't actually pre-order this book despite having been quite excited about it, and then when I did get it as a Christmas present from my very, very good friend Asher, it kind of sat on my shelf for a while. Why is a book that I've been so looking forward to just sitting on my shelf? Why am I not reading it? And eventually the time came, I was like, no, it's time, we've got to read this. The biggest thing standing in my way was honestly that I was scared it wouldn't live up to how much I loved the Night Circus. Now I know the Night Circus isn't for everyone. Some people really don't suit the way that it's written. It's a very specific book. I personally adore the Night Circus. I think it's just absolutely wonderful, and I'll get into some of the reasons why I love it in this video. But I wanted to talk about how, if you loved the Night Circus or if you didn't like the Night Circus, how that'll impact your reading of the Starless Sea, and also review the Starless Sea. So that's what this video is. Side note, I know everything's a bit mad at the moment. I'm not gonna get hugely into it as I think we're all a bit saturated in how mad everything is. I hope you're all doing okay. So this review will be spoiler-free for the Starless Sea, but will probably have some spoilers for the Night Circus, just in the sense that I will say, this book has this, the Night Circus does not. So you will know what isn't there or what might be in the Night Circus that doesn't appear in this. So while I won't get into huge plot points of the Night Circus, just be aware that you may hear things about the book if you wanted to go in completely knowing nothing, which is actually semi what I would recommend for the Night Circus. Then perhaps go away, read these two books and come back. Or go away and just read the Night Circus and come back. That's up to you. I wanted to start by talking about the world that Erin Morgenstern creates in this book. Now in the Night Circus, the whole book feels very cohesive, but there are these kind of two different worlds. There's a lot of dual things happening within the book. So you have the vibrant, amazing world of the circus, and you have the kind of ordinary human world. And that's kind of reflected in the Starless Sea. In the Starless Sea we have the world as we know it. We have Zachary at university, we have his mum who is a fortune teller, but it's very much rooted in kind of reality. And then we have the harbour and the Starless Sea and all of this kind of subterranean feeling thing, and it's that kind of neverwhere feeling of this has always been there, it's just something that you as a person in reality do not have access to, which is one of my favourite things. It captures that essence of there's something special, and if I can just find a way to access it, I will have access to that magical world. It's that same everyone's waiting for their Hogwarts letter kind of feeling. Unlike the Night Circus, which is late 1800s, Starless Sea's reality is the modern world. We have Zachary, who I will get onto as a character later, but it's things like he's studying, he's not a, English major, which would be the expected thing for this book, but he's studying video game narrative, and I think that's so interesting. And things like, how do phones work? If you've taken your phone with you into this other reality, it's not a huge focus, but it is an interesting look at that kind of duality. What's interesting is that where a lot of books try and integrate their two worlds and explain to you, well, how do these kind of liminal spaces between them work? How do we cross barriers? It felt much more to me like it was, once you're in the Starless Sea, right, that's where this story's gone now. And all of the reality we were getting was through Zachary's friend, which comes much later in the book. I just thought that was one of the things the book did really well, was these two worlds. The Starless Sea and the harbour have this kind of weirder history and lore to them, whereas the modern world is very much sort of, it is what it is. The way that Erin Morgenstern makes the harbour feel so tempting and so kind of amazing in comparison to the real world, while never kind of downplaying the real world, I thought was really interesting. In my opinion, one of the best parts of the Night Circus is all of the descriptions of the various activities happening at the circus. They come kind of interspersed between different things. So we get descriptions of things like the contortionist, we get descriptions of the acrobatics tent. And they're some of the best parts of the book because they really make you want to be there. It's that thing of, this doesn't exist in my world and I need it to. I need to find where this is because I need to experience this atmosphere. It's an atmosphere thing, really. The best kind of analogy I can think of is if you ever watched the British TV series Skins as a child / teenager, probably teenager, and got completely overwhelmingly disappointed that no teenage parties were like this. That's what it feels like. It's nothing is like this why have you presented this to me now? I can never have this. And it's amazing. That happens a lot in the Night Circus, and it also happens in Starless Sea. The one moment that I really thought captured that for me and made me go, okay, no, I'm not going to be completely disappointed by this book, is quite early on. Zachary goes to a party, and it's a literary themed party, and just the descriptions of everyone's costumes and what's happening and the allure of it all, it's just amazing. And if you want to capture some of that from the Night Circus, I definitely think you will. There's fewer moments like that in the Starless Sea, but I think that's because the idea of exclusivity and something you'd have to access comes much more in through this idea of, you know, a secret door is presented to you and, you know, you go through it, rather than you get to go to a circus that does not exist. If you're familiar with the Night Circus, you'll know that it basically takes place in kind of a scattered timeline. Things happen in a broadly chronological order, but sometimes we get jumps ahead to this is what's happening. Yeah, we can go from 1884 to 1897 in a chapter, and they're not long chapters. It really works as a narrative structure because you get a lot of reveals that you don't realise are reveals until later on. It's such a clever book. Starless Sea does a similar thing, but it doesn't play with time as much. We get chapters of the story, so Zachary's story, it's much more focused in on just that one perspective for the most part. We have Zachary's story, and then also kind of sandwiched between those bits of story we have extracts from the works that are being talked about within the book. So there are these weird books that nobody really knows about. It's very the Hazelwood in that kind of plot point. We get chapters from those books, and those chapters have relevance to the story that Zachary's exploring, and he does a similar thing to the Night Circus. I don't think it's ever quite as clever, but I think that might also be because I've read the Night Circus so many times that you get more out of it the more times you read it. Overall, within that structure, the plot is quite good. I think it's not as strong as the Night Circus's plot, just because the Night Circus comes from a much more understandable place. I think the Starless Sea was a bit more out there. It takes a lot more of going, okay, I'll just agree with you that that's a thing that is happening, rather than this idea of, okay, we know vaguely how magic works, let's go on from there. But the plot itself is interesting, and it involves a lot of things that I enjoy, like people being put on different parts of a journey. There's a lot of snags and twists and turns within that story. There's a lot of characters who recur throughout different things, and suddenly you realise that that throwaway character from earlier was actually quite significant. There's a lot happening. I think where it gets let down, and I won't spoil it, I promise, that it gets let down towards the very end. And I think part of that is because I will get on to the relationships in this book later, but I think part of that's to do with the romance, and I think part of that's to do with, it's kind of this overwhelming, toppling thing by that point, that pulling it back in together is just sort of, not impossible, but really difficult to do. Despite having a very contained cast of characters, there's a lot happening. The last kind of little bit felt oddly rushed, and at the same time it was that sense of, okay, I've got all this way, what's happening now? And I think that might be something that shifts in a reread, because as I say, you'll get more out of it, but just perhaps be aware that it doesn't continue to build all the way. It kind of drips off towards the end. Let's talk about characters. I really enjoyed Zachary as a character. One of the things that is semi-missing in the Night Circus, I think it's a product of when it was published, it is a kind of queer story. Now there is one in the Night Circus, won't spoil it, but there is one. It was interesting to have a gay main character, Zachary, and he's openly gay from the beginning, and it's not a story about him being gay. It's just really nice. It's a sort of casual, there it is. And as I've mentioned before, I think what's interesting about Zachary is that he's not this typical tweed-wearing, I read books and that makes me interesting person that we would expect to kind of be this person who falls into a door and has a magic library experience. He does love books and stories, but his focus, as I say, is on video game narrative, and it makes for how he explores this adventure so much more interesting, in my opinion, because you get just little snippets of, you know, he's walking in this journey and he'll pick up something and it'll say item acquired, and it's cheesy and funny, but also, again, it roots it in that modern reality that you don't necessarily get when you have these library characters who are intentionally rejecting the modern. Zachary's very much aware that these things can mesh, and I really appreciated that. As I say, it's quite a limited cast of characters for a book with quite a lot of scope. Even then, I still feel like I could have got more from some of these characters. There's a lot of revealing who they are much later on, which gives you less scope to explore their narrative. So it's very much mostly about Zachary, I think, and maybe Mirabelle on top of that. And again, it's towards the end where some new characters are being brought in, or characters that have been referenced are being brought in, that it starts to get a bit messy because we lose that tight focus. But within the story there are a lot of relationships. Zachary's romantic relationship within the story I thought was really well handled. It felt very fast, but I think that's just the thing of, in a book where there's quite a lot happening and it's all quite mysterious and magical anyway, you do sort of have to let go of that relationships take time to build and assume that if people make it through books that they will deal with the fact that they met very quickly later. I've always maintained the Night Circus is primarily a romance. It's not a romance novel, but the plot is very much driven by romance with a magic influence. Starless less so, it's more about the adventure storyline. It's sort of the ratio flipped, I suppose. Both are good. I didn't feel like either of them, it bothered me, but perhaps just something to keep in mind if you're someone who really loves a romance plot, if you want the kind of sweeping love story that is the Night Circus, it's not quite that. The last thing I want to touch on is something that I've been thinking a lot about since I read this book, and it's books about books. I've talked about this a bit on my blog. I think I've talked about it on this channel before. I have a real problem with books about books in general. We've had many of them. We've had things like The Hazelwood, which I've already mentioned. This year we've had The Unlikely Escape of Uriah Heep. We've had The Library of the Unwritten. We've had The Binding in previous years. There's a lot of books out there that cover this kind of library sense. Strange the Dreamer was sold on it has a magical library in it. Quite often these books fall flat. As I say, they usually, not always, but quite often present us with these library characters that aren't interesting. They just come across as pretentious, and it's a lot of things about people who love books, which I understand because you're trying to sell books to people who love books. Hello, I also love books. But what really got me about the Starless Sea and other books that do this well is that they aren't actually books about books, they're books about stories. And the Starless Sea really, really takes that to heart. It's all about stories and narrative and bringing those together, which is why the video game stuff plays such an important part, because it's saying that actually books aren't the only way we have that we tell these stories. We present narrative in so many different ways. Overall, I think I personally like the Night Circus more than Starless Sea. Again, that could be because I've read the Night Circus so many times that it's got that nostalgia factor for me. It was a big part of getting back into reading after a long reading break. But I do think the Starless Sea picks up a lot of the stuff that is so good in the Night Circus, and it really highlights where Erin Morgenstern's writing talents come in. If you did not like the Night Circus, unless that was because you didn't like the romance, I don't think you should pick up the Starless Sea, because it's very similar. But
result from search.
Be quiet, Google, I don't need you right now. That's terrifying. To flip that on its head, if you did like the Night Circus and you're nervous about reading the Starless Sea because what could live up to it, I think you will enjoy it. I didn't like it as much, but that could just be me. But I will absolutely read it again, and I think it is well worth picking up. Hopefully that's given you a bit of insight into my thoughts on Starless Sea. I really enjoyed reading it, and I definitely wanted to have a bit of a talk about it because it had been so kind of ominously sitting on my shelf waiting for me to pick it up. I'd love to hear what you thought if you've already read it, or if you've read the Night Circus and you're not sure. Just like basically let me know your thoughts in the comments below. You can also follow me on all of my socials to hear what I'm reading kind of real time. They will all be linked in the description below. While you're here, you may as well subscribe if you want to hear more bookish chat from me. I have some other stuff coming up. I have some vlogs, I have some more reviews. It's nearly time for all of my April TBR videos and such, so that'll be fun. Subscribe so you're the first to know about those. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one.